The mysterious call, 5 to 7 minute hook. The stars were quiet that night. Across the vast, empty expanse of space, no one expected anything unusual. But deep within the darkness of the galaxy, a signal was sent, a call for help that would change everything. On a small forgotten planet in a distant corner of the universe, a species known as the Quarics were struggling for survival. Their world, once lush and full of life, was now a battlefield. A ruthless enemy had invaded their peaceful home, destroying cities, burning forests, and crushing any resistance that rose against them. The Quarics were fragile, with their soft skin and delicate bones, no match for the brutal forces that had come to claim their world. They had fought back, but it was clear there was no hope for them. Their extinction was just a matter of time. In a last-ditch effort, the Quarics sent out a distress signal, a message broadcasted across the stars, hoping for a miracle. It was their final cry. They knew they had no one left to turn to. But somewhere, someone was listening. The signal reached far beyond their own galaxy, and it was intercepted by the Deathworlders. Kale, the leader of the Deathworlders, sat in his command center aboard their massive ship, staring at the glowing screen in front of him. His mind was always alert, always ready for battle. But this signal, it was different. The message wasn't a simple SOS from a planet under attack. It was something more. Desperation, fear, and an almost pleading tone echoed in the words. The Quarics had no choice but to reach out to anyone, even if they didn't know who they were calling. The signal buzzed, static crackling in the background. The words were barely audible, but they were enough. We are the Quarics. Our world is dying. Please, help us. Anyone. We cannot survive alone. The message was brief but powerful. Kel's mind raced as he listened to it again, his thoughts focused on the same thing. Who would answer such a call? His first instinct was to ignore it. The Deathworlders had enough battles of their own. They were fighters, surviving on the most dangerous planets in the galaxy, but their battles were their own. They didn't owe anyone anything. They had already lost so much. But there was something in the voice of the Quarics that pulled at him. They weren't asking for help. They were begging for it. And something about that desperation made it hard to turn away. Kale stood up and paced the room. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the ship's control panel, his hands running through his short, dark hair. He had seen many things in his life, many battles and many enemies, but he had never heard a call for help like this one. Kale. A voice called from behind him. It was Captain Sira, his most trusted officer. What's going on? We just received a distress signal, right? Kale turned to face her. She was strong, with a steady hand and unwavering loyalty, but even she could sense something was off about this message. He nodded, his expression grim. Yes, it's from a species called the Quarics. They're in trouble. Major trouble. Their planet is under siege. Sira crossed her arms. What's their plan? What kind of enemy are they up against? Kel's jaw tightened. I don't know. They didn't say much. They've lost everything. And they're asking for any help, no matter who answers. We're the only ones who might be close enough to do something about it. Sira paused, her eyes narrowing. You're thinking about responding to this, aren't you? Kale looked down at the message again. The Quarics were on the brink of extinction. It was a long shot, but if anyone could stand a chance, it was the Deathworlders. They had survived battles that most couldn't even imagine. But even so, Kale knew this was dangerous. The unknown enemy they would face could be more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. But then, Kale thought of his people, the Deathworlders, the fiercest warriors in the galaxy, born and bred to survive impossible odds. They had seen the worst of the universe, and yet they stood strong. They didn't turn away from challenges. If the Quarics were to survive, it would be because of them. We have to help them, Kale said, his voice steady, a spark of determination in his eyes. We don't leave anyone to die, not when we can do something about it. Sira looked at him, a quiet understanding in her gaze. She knew what this meant. The mission would be dangerous. The unknown enemy could be deadly. But she also knew that Kale was right. They couldn't ignore the cry for help. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "We'll answer the call. But we need to prepare. We don't know what we're walking into." Kale nodded. "Get the crew ready. We leave at once." As Kale turned to issue the orders, his thoughts raced. The Quarics were desperate, and the Deathworlders might be their only hope. But what were they walking into? Who were the enemies of the Quarics? And why did they send such a desperate message? The mystery of the Quarics' enemy was just beginning to unfold. And for Kale and his team, the greatest challenge they would face wasn't just the battle. It was what lay waiting for them on that distant, dying world. The journey begins. The massive ship of the Deathworlders cut through the void of space, heading toward the distant planet where the Quarics were fighting for their survival. The ship's dark hull reflected the stars as it passed, the eerie silence of space broken only by the soft hum of its engines. Inside, the crew was busy, preparing for what they knew would be a dangerous mission. Kale stood at the helm of the ship, staring out into the endless black. The weight of the situation pressed on him, but his face remained calm, resolute. They were Deathworlders, after all. Fear wasn't something they felt. They had survived the most brutal worlds the galaxy had to offer. But the unknown enemy that had driven the Quarics to the edge of extinction, that was something new. Behind him, Captain Sira stepped up, her footsteps echoing through the quiet command room. "We're approaching the Quaric homeworld, Kale," she said, her voice steady. "Readings are showing extreme damage to their planet. The atmosphere's unstable, and there's heavy interference. It's like the world is dying." Kale nodded, his eyes narrowing. No surprises there. The Quarics said their world was under siege. But I've never seen anything this bad. What could do this to a planet? Syra's brow furrowed as she studied the readings on her console. "I don't know. But we'll find out soon enough." They both turned as the main view screen flickered to life, showing a picture of the Quaric world below. The planet was a mess of dark clouds and fiery storms, swirling across the surface. The oceans were boiling, and the land was cracked and broken. It looked like something from a nightmare. Kale felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an attack. This was destruction on a scale that even he wasn't used to. He turned back to Sira. "Get us down there. We need to assess the situation, find out who's behind this, and if we can, stop them." Sira nodded, her expression focused. "Aye, sir. We're entering the atmosphere now." The ship began to descend, and Kale could feel the turbulence as they punched through the thick clouds. The view outside shifted from chaos to a world in total disarray. The once beautiful green landscape was now nothing more than a wasteland, burned, broken, and poisoned by the enemy. As they neared the surface, the ship's sensors began to pick up strange readings. Unusual energy signatures pulsed beneath the ground, and Kale's instincts told him they were walking into something far worse than just a planetary invasion. The Quarics' enemy wasn't just conquering, they were altering the very fabric of the planet. The damage wasn't just physical, it was deeper. The ship finally landed in a clearing, its massive feet touching the scorched earth. The crew unbuckled their harnesses, grabbing weapons and equipment, ready for whatever awaited them outside. Kale led the way, stepping down the ramp first, his boots crunching on the ash-covered ground. The moment he stepped outside, he could feel the heat of the planet's surface. The air was thick and oppressive, heavy with the smell of burnt vegetation and metal. He squinted against the intense glare of the red sun, trying to get his bearings. Sira followed closely behind, scanning the area for threats. "Stay alert," she warned. "We don't know what's out there." The Quarics weren't able to give us much information, and if their enemy has already done this much damage. Kale nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. "I know. Keep your eyes open. And remember, we're here to help. These people are depending on us." The Deathworlders spread out, their senses sharp, every step calculated. They moved cautiously toward the nearest settlement, which once might have been a thriving village. Now it was nothing more than a pile of rubble. The air was thick with the sense of loss, of a civilization on the brink of annihilation. "Look at this place," said one of the soldiers, a younger member of the crew. "What kind of enemy could do this?" Cale didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were elsewhere, his eyes scanning the horizon. Then he saw it. Movement, a shadow flickering between the ruins. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then he saw it again. There was something there, something fast, something watching them. "Stay sharp," Cale commanded, his voice low but firm. "We've got company." The group quickened their pace, closing the distance to the settlement. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. The air crackled with tension. Something was waiting for them. They reached the heart of the village, but there was no sign of the Korax. The streets were empty, and the buildings were reduced to piles of rubble and ash. As Cal stepped over a fallen beam, he heard a faint sound, a soft whimper. His heart skipped a beat. "Over here," shouted one of the soldiers, pointing to a narrow alley. Cal rushed over, his pulse quickening. There, huddled together in the shadows, were a small group of Korax. They looked terrified, their large eyes wide with fear. They were weak, exhausted, and many were injured, but they had survived. One of them, a female Korak, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You came. You heard our call." Cale knelt before her. "We heard you," he said, his voice reassuring. "You're safe now. We'll protect you. But we need to know what happened. Who did this?" The Korak woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "They came from the sky. The invaders. They control the planet now. They take our energy. They feed off it. They are everywhere." Cal's heart sank. They weren't just facing an enemy. They were facing something that could consume the very life force of a planet. And that meant one thing. They weren't just fighting for the survival of the Korax. They were fighting for the survival of the entire world. He stood up, turning to his team. "This is worse than we thought. We're not just fighting an invasion. We're fighting something that controls the very essence of this world." The Deathworlders exchanged grim looks. They had no idea what they were up against, but Cal's resolve only grew stronger. They had to win. For the Korax, for their world, for the galaxy. And with that thought, the true battle for survival began. The silent enemy. The Deathworlders had barely begun to understand the magnitude of the danger they were facing when a strange sense of unease began to settle over them. The Korax, though fragile and desperate, were beginning to recover from their initial shock. Yet, despite their presence, the alien world felt eerily quiet, as though something unseen was watching them. Cale and his team gathered in a makeshift command center within the remains of one of the Korak villages. They had set up basic communication devices, but the signals were weak. Interference seemed to be coming from everywhere. The planet was trying to protect itself, but against what? Syrah looked over at Cal, who was staring at the data on his screen. "Something's wrong." The Korax didn't say much about the enemy's capabilities, but there's no way they could have taken down their entire civilization without a fight. There's got to be more to this. Cale tapped his fingers on the control panel. "Yes, we've only seen the aftermath so far, but this planet's destruction doesn't make sense. It feels as though it's being systematically drained of life. The land, the creatures, even the atmosphere itself. Whatever they're up against, it's far beyond anything we've encountered before." One of the soldiers, a sharp-eyed veteran named Rourke, spoke up. "We're not alone out here. I've been sensing something since we arrived. At first, I thought it was just the tension. But now, I'm certain. Something's watching us." Cal's jaw tightened. "I've felt it too. But I've seen worse. We've all survived worse. Whatever it is, we can handle it. We just need to be smart." But even as Kel spoke, a growing sense of dread began to settle over the team. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. Outside, the planet's silence grew heavier, more oppressive. Even the winds had stopped, leaving a stillness that felt unnatural. The Deathworlders moved out in pairs, continuing their investigation. The Quorix had given them a few clues, vague descriptions of their enemies, but nothing concrete. They were only fragments of information that didn't quite fit together. Shadows in the dark, strange noises in the night, and creatures that seemed to phase in and out of reality. The more they learned, the more they realized how little they understood. Kale turned to his second-in-command, Riva, who had been studying the surrounding area. Riva, you and your team take the East Ridge. See if you can find any signs of their forces. If you can't get a clear signal, then we go in blind. Riva nodded, but her expression was tense. Understood, sir. But, Kale, I've got a bad feeling about this. Kale placed a hand on her shoulder. Trust your instincts. I'm counting on you. As Riva and her team disappeared into the distance, Kale couldn't shake the growing sense that something was lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting to make its move. Several hours later, the team reconvened. No one had seen anything. At least nothing that could be identified. But something was wrong. As they gathered back in the village, the air felt even heavier than before. It was as though the very land itself was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, a crackling sound came over the comm system, followed by a low, chilling hum that seemed to vibrate through the bones of every Deathworlder in the group. Cal's grip tightened on his weapon as he heard the unmistakable sound of movement, a presence drawing closer. But there was no sign of any enemy force. No footsteps, no approaching ships, just the low hum that grew louder with every passing second. And then it happened. From the corners of the village, strange shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Figures that were too quick to be seen fully, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, moving like ghosts in the dimming light. The team immediately took defensive positions, weapons raised, eyes scanning every corner, but there was no clear target. Nothing solid to aim at. Every time they tried to lock in on a shape, it disappeared, only to reappear somewhere else. The shadows were alive, and they were moving faster than anyone could react. Cal's voice was steady as he spoke into the comms. Don't fire unless you see something solid. These creatures are using the shadows. Stay focused. But even as he spoke, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The very earth seemed to ripple and twist as if the planet itself was responding to some unseen force. The air thickened, and an eerie wind began to swirl around the Deathworlders, carrying with it a sound that sent a shiver down their spines. A low, guttural growl, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The flickering shapes closed in. For a brief moment, a figure stepped fully into the light, a tall, humanoid creature, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. It was cloaked in darkness, its body seemingly made of the very shadows it hid in. A creature unlike anything Kel had ever seen. Back, Kale shouted, signaling the team to fall back toward the ship. They couldn't fight what they couldn't see. But the shadows followed them, relentless, unyielding. Every time they moved, the figures would vanish, only to appear once again, closer than before. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every passing second. Cal's heart raced as he led the team toward their ship. They had underestimated their enemy. These weren't just invaders. They were something far more dangerous. Whatever these creatures were, they didn't just kill. They hunted, they stalked, and they controlled the very fabric of the world around them. Rourke, the soldier who had first sensed something, looked at Kel, fear in his eyes. They're everywhere, Kale. And they're not just after us. They're after the planet itself. Cal's mind raced. The Quorix weren't just facing an invasion. This was something far worse, a force that could manipulate the planet, bend reality itself. This enemy didn't just conquer, it consumed. As the Deathworlders reached the ship and began to board, Kale knew one thing for certain. The real fight was only just beginning. And if they didn't figure out how to stop these shadow creatures soon, the entire planet, along with everyone on it, would be lost. The heart of darkness. The Deathworlders huddled inside their ship, a sense of unease settling over them as they prepared for what came next. The strange creatures, the shadows, had forced them to retreat faster than they'd ever imagined. They had barely made it to the ship before the earth trembled beneath their feet, as if the very planet itself was alive and working against them. Kale stood at the command console, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the readings. The ship's sensors were picking up strange fluctuations, deeper than anything they had encountered before. The shadows had disappeared, but Kale knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. They hadn't won. They had only bought themselves a few precious minutes. Kale, Captain Sura's voice cut through the tense silence. We're not going to make it off this planet if we don't figure out what we're dealing with. Those things, they're not just creatures. They're manipulating the environment, the very fabric of this world. And the Quarics, whatever they did to call us here, it seems to have made everything worse. Kale nodded grimly. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the soldiers when they had witnessed the creatures flicker in and out of existence. The shadows weren't just a physical threat. They were something far more insidious. They were tapping into the planet itself, draining its energy, twisting its essence. He turned to Rourke, the sharp-eyed veteran who had sensed the presence of the shadows first. Rourke, you're the most familiar with alien life forms. What do you make of this? Rourke was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant as he processed everything. Finally, he spoke. I've seen predators before, big ones, vicious ones, but this is different. This isn't just a fight for survival. It's like they're feeding off the planet, like they're in control of it. And I think the Quarics might have done something to draw them here. Kale frowned. The Quarics? They're the victims. How could they possibly bring this upon themselves? Rourke looked up, his eyes dark with realization. Maybe they didn't know what they were dealing with. Maybe the distress call they sent wasn't just for help. Maybe it was a signal. Kale's eyes widened. The pieces were starting to come together. A signal. You think they called these creatures here on purpose? I don't know, Rourke admitted. But whatever happened, the planet is alive in a way I've never seen before. It's like it's responding to something. Something dark. Sura stepped forward, her face hard with determination. Then we have no choice. We need to find out what that signal was, where it came from, and how we can stop it, before those things come back. Kale nodded. Right. We're going after that signal. The team prepared for another excursion into the planet's heart. This time, they would venture deeper into the ruins of the Quaric city where the signal had originated. The air outside was still thick with heat, the atmosphere buzzing with a low hum that set the hairs on the back of their necks on edge. The Deathworlders moved out in full force, weapons drawn, eyes darting around, every shadow a potential threat. They reached the heart of the city, where the signal seemed to be coming from. The ruins here were more intact than the rest of the planet, but that wasn't saying much. The once thriving metropolis was now a graveyard. Skyscrapers had crumbled to dust, streets lay in ruins, and broken pieces of technology littered the ground. The energy in the air felt thick, almost alive, like the planet itself was trying to communicate with them. As they approached a massive structure in the center of the city, they found a strange sight. A large, dark obelisk stood in the middle of a shattered plaza. It glowed faintly with a red light, pulsing rhythmically. It was the source of the signal. This is it, Kale said, voice low. This is what brought the shadows here. The team cautiously moved forward, keeping their distance from the obelisk. It looked ancient, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change with every glance. The closer they got, the more they felt the oppressive weight of the planet's energy bearing down on them. The very air around the obelisk seemed to shimmer, as though reality itself was bending around it. Work stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the obelisk. I've never seen anything like this before. These symbols. They're not from any known civilization. They're alien, but they feel wrong, like they've been warped. Syrah frowned. Can we shut it down? Destroy it? I don't know, Kale said, but I don't think it's that simple. This thing is connected to the planet, and if it's feeding off the world, then any damage we do to it could tear the planet apart. We need to understand it first. Just as Kale spoke, the ground beneath their feet trembled once again. The hum grew louder, and then silence. The shadows had returned. This time, they were not alone. The shadows were gathering around the obelisk, drawn to it like moths to a flame. The figures began to take shape, humanoid but distorted, their forms flickering in and out of existence. They were growing stronger, faster. This is it, Kale shouted. We have to destroy that obelisk now. But as they raised their weapons to strike, the shadows surged forward, faster than ever. One by one, they attacked, their eerie forms moving with unnatural speed, closing in on the Deathworlders. The team fought back with everything they had, but it was clear that their enemies were not just physical. They were something deeper, something that could twist reality itself. Kale could see it in their eyes. The shadows weren't just attacking them. They were trying to break their spirits, to wear them down. Fall back, Kale ordered, firing into the mass of shadows. We can't take them head on. But even as they retreated, Kale knew the truth. If they didn't stop the obelisk, if they didn't sever the connection to whatever dark force controlled it, they would never escape this world. The shadows would never stop hunting them. They had to find a way to destroy it, or they would all become lost in the dark. The unseen battle. The Deathworlders retreated to the outskirts of the city, their hearts racing as they regrouped and tended to their wounded. The shadows had struck with a terrifying intensity, and even the most hardened soldiers were beginning to show signs of fear. The obelisk pulsed with an eerie glow, its ominous hum still reverberating through the air. Kel's mind raced as he paced back and forth, his thoughts swirling. The obelisk was at the heart of it all, the source of the signal, the source of the shadows. But every time they tried to approach it, the shadows struck faster than they could respond, their movements too erratic and unpredictable. It was clear now. The shadows weren't just protecting the obelisk. They were bound to it, and whatever dark power controlled the obelisk seemed to have a grasp on the very fabric of reality itself. We need a plan, Kale muttered to himself. His hand gripped the control panel of the comms unit, his eyes darting back and forth between the other members of his team. Riva, who had been standing off to the side, finally spoke up. We've been doing this wrong. We're fighting the shadows on their terms, in the open. They know this planet better than we do. If we want to stand a chance, we need to turn the tables. Kale looked at her, intrigued. What do you mean? Riva's expression was grim. We need to find a way to break their connection to the planet. That obelisk is the key. If we can somehow sever it from the world's core, we might weaken the shadows enough to get a clear shot at them. But it won't be easy. Syrah, who had been listening intently, nodded. We've got to take the fight to them, in their own element. We can't just wait for them to strike again. Kale thought for a moment, then made his decision. All right, we move fast. We need to destroy the obelisk, but we need a diversion. Something big enough to draw their attention away from us long enough for Riva and the others to get close enough to plant the charges. The team nodded, ready for the next phase of their mission. Kale knew this was a gamble, a dangerous one, but it was the only chance they had left. If they failed, the planet, and everyone on it, would be lost. Nightfall descended on the planet like a suffocating blanket. The Deathworlders moved through the city in the cover of darkness, staying low and silent. The shadows were still out there, flickering in and out of existence, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Kale led the charge, his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the obelisk once again. The air was thick with tension, and every step they took felt like a step closer to the unknown. "Stay close," Kale whispered into the comms. "Riva, you're with me. We'll plant the charges on the obelisk. The rest of you, take your positions. We need to make sure nothing stops us this time." Riva nodded, her eyes narrowed in determination. "Got it. We move fast." The group split into two teams. Kale, Riva, and a few others moved towards the obelisk, while the second team fanned out to create the diversion. They knew the shadows would try to prevent them from reaching the obelisk, but they had to act quickly. Every second counted. As Kale and his team neared the obelisk, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The air was cold, as if the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The glowing symbols on the obelisk pulsed in time with the low hum, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward them, reaching for them. Suddenly, the shadows appeared again, this time in greater numbers. Their forms flickered and writhed, moving in and out of sight like phantoms. They closed in on the Deathworlders, their glowing red eyes burning with malicious intent. "Move," Kale shouted, pushing forward. The team opened fire, but it was like shooting into smoke. The shadows dodged every shot, their movements too fast to track. Kale's weapon clicked empty, and he tossed it aside, drawing his blade. The battle had become a game of cat and mouse, with the Deathworlders struggling to land a single blow. Riva and the others reached the obelisk and began to plant the charges, but the shadows were everywhere now, surrounding them, closing in. They were no longer just an enemy. They were a force of nature, relentless and unyielding. Kale fought back with everything he had, but it was clear the shadows weren't just attacking. They were trying to overwhelm their minds. The creatures flickered, their forms distorting, their whispers reaching into the depths of Kale's thoughts. He felt his resolve weakening, but he shook it off. He couldn't let them win. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Charges are set," Riva shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Get clear." Kale grabbed her arm and pulled her back, leading the team away from the obelisk. But just as they turned to leave, a deafening roar filled the air. The shadows surged forward with a final, terrifying push, their forms coalescing into a massive, towering figure, a creature that was part shadow, part nightmare. Kale's heart skipped a beat. This was no mere predator. This was the source of the shadows, the true enemy, and it was coming for them. "Run," Kale shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. "Get to the ship. Now." The Deathworlders ran for their lives, the towering figure of the shadow creature gaining on them with each step. They could hear its snarls and growls, its presence like a dark cloud, suffocating and overwhelming. But they didn't stop. Not until they reached the ship. Kale and his team barely made it inside, slamming the door behind them. They didn't have time to breathe. Riva hit the detonator, and the obelisk exploded in a blinding flash, sending shockwaves through the air. The ground shook violently, and the shadows screamed in agony as the connection between them and the obelisk was severed. The massive shadow creature roared one final time, its form collapsing into nothingness. For a moment, everything went quiet. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the planet seemed to breathe again. But Kale knew this wasn't the end. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. There were still enemies out there, still threats waiting to rise again. The final stand. The ship shuddered as it ascended into the sky, the planet's surface disappearing beneath them. Kale and the rest of the crew had narrowly escaped with their lives, but the cost of their victory weighed heavily on them. The obelisk had been destroyed, but the shadows, those terrifying otherworldly creatures, were not truly gone. They had only been pushed back. The real battle was far from over. Kale stood at the helm, staring out into the endless void of space. The stars seemed to mock him, distant and cold. He could still hear the screams of the shadows in his mind, feel their presence lingering just beyond the edge of his thoughts. The tension was unbearable. "We made it out, Hale," Riva said quietly, stepping up beside him. "For now, at least. But we know it's not over." He turned to her, his gaze dark. "I know. We've only scratched the surface. Those shadows, they're more than just an enemy. They're a force. A living force that's tied to the very fabric of this universe. If we don't find a way to stop them for good, they'll keep coming. And next time, we might not make it out alive." Syra's voice crackled over the comms from the back of the ship. "Kale, we've detected something. It's a fleet coming toward us, and it's not friendly." Kale's blood ran cold. A fleet? Who could be coming for them now? "Who are they?" he demanded, rushing over to the comm station. Riva peered over his shoulder at the readings. "They're not showing up on our scans. They're cloaked, but their presence is unmistakable. Whoever they are, they're preparing for war." "Get ready for a fight," Kale ordered, his tone sharp. "We need to prepare defenses. All hands on deck." The crew scrambled into action, preparing the ship for battle. Weapons were checked, shields activated, and the engines were primed for evasive maneuvers. Kale could feel the tension in the air as they waited for the unknown fleet to make its move. The fear from the earlier battle with the shadows had faded, replaced by the cold certainty of what was to come. As the fleet drew closer, the cloaking devices on their ships began to fail, revealing their massive, angular warships. The ships were unlike anything Kale had ever seen, sleek, dark, and ominous, with jagged edges and an aura of raw power. They were clearly not from the same civilization that had sent the distress call. "Who the hell are these guys?" Riva muttered, her hand gripping the control panel as she checked the ship's weapons system. "They're not the Quarks, but their technology is advanced. Too advanced. They're the ones behind the shadows," Kale said, his voice low. "They'd been manipulating the Quarks, using them as pawns, and now they've come to finish what they started." Syra's voice came through again. "Kale, we've got incoming fire. They're launching projectiles. Fast. Evasive maneuvers. Get us out of here." Kale shouted, taking his seat at the controls. The ship lurched as it veered sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a barrage of plasma bolts that scorched the space where they had been just seconds before. The entire crew was thrown into chaos as the ship rocketed through space, dodging attack after attack from the enemy fleet. Kel's mind raced as he strategized their next move. The enemy ships were fast, their weapons powerful, but they had one advantage. They were Deathworlders, and no matter how strong their enemies were, they had been through worse. "We need to make them regret coming after us," Kale muttered, gripping the control panel as he locked onto one of the enemy ships. "Riva, get us within range. We're not running from this fight." Riva nodded, her face set in determination as she fired up the ship's weapon systems. Target locked. Weapons ready. The Deathworlders ship surged forward, closing the distance between them and the enemy fleet. A volley of missiles shot from their ship, streaking through space toward the closest warship. It exploded in a brilliant flash, but the victory was short-lived. The remaining enemy ships retaliated, launching another round of attacks. "We're not going to make it if we keep playing their game," Kale said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We need to take the fight to them. Up close, personal. We're boarding their flagship." Syra's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? That's suicide." Kale met her gaze. "It's the only chance we have. If we can take down their command ship, the rest of the fleet will fall apart. We have to hit them hard and fast." With a grim nod, Syra agreed. "All right, let's do it." The Deathworlders ship maneuvered through the debris of the destroyed warship, heading straight for the heart of the enemy fleet. The tension was unbearable as they closed in on the flagship, an enormous ship that seemed to loom in the distance, its weapons charging up for another attack. "Prepare for boarding," Kale ordered. "And keep your heads down. We only have one shot at this." The team was ready. They had faced death before, and they would face it again. This time, however, it was different. They were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to end it all, to break the cycle and stop the threat once and for all. As the team prepared to board, Kel's thoughts turned to the shadows. They had been a warning, a sign of something darker lurking in the universe. The enemy fleet was the final piece of the puzzle, but Kel knew that even if they destroyed this fleet, there would always be more. The universe was vast, and the forces of darkness seemed endless. But the Deathworlders were ready. They were ready to fight, to sacrifice, and to stand against the darkness until their last breath. The final confrontation. The Deathworlders' ship hurtled toward the enemy flagship, the massive vessel growing larger with each passing second. Cal's heart raced as he steadied his grip on the controls, the ship shaking violently from the continuous barrage of enemy fire. The crew was tense, but determined. This was it, the last chance to end the war and stop the horrors that had plagued countless worlds. "Steady, everyone," Cal ordered through the comms. His voice was calm, but underneath it, the weight of the mission pressed on him. "We're going in." Riva, who was standing by the weapons console, nodded grimly. "All systems are go. We'll make it through this, Cal." The flagship loomed ahead, its weapons flashing as it unleashed another devastating volley of fire. But the Deathworlders were ready. They had trained for this moment, and they weren't about to let it slip away. "We're cutting through," Cal shouted, flipping a switch that engaged the ship's final assault mode. The Deathworlders' ship shot forward with a surge of power, dodging the enemy's fire as it closed in on the flagship. "Brace for impact," Sira yelled, her voice urgent. They were heading straight for the flagship's docking bay. If they could make it, they would board and take the fight to the heart of the enemy. Just as they neared the docking bay, an explosion rocked the ship, throwing everyone off balance. The Deathworlders' ship was hit, but it stayed on course. The docking bay doors of the enemy flagship came into view, and with a loud crash, their ship slammed into the bay, its hull scraping against the metal surface. "Go! Go! Go!" Cal yelled as he was the first to leap from his seat and grab his weapon. His team followed quickly, their determination unwavering despite the chaos. The moment they stepped off the ship, they were met with resistance. The enemy soldiers, clad in dark armor, rushed toward them, weapons drawn. But the Deathworlders were faster. They moved with deadly precision, cutting through the enemy ranks like a hot knife through butter. Cal led the charge, his blade flashing as he struck down enemy after enemy. The team fought together, covering each other's backs, as they advanced deeper into the flagship's corridors. The air was thick with tension, and every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the enemy fleet. "We're almost there," Cal said through gritted teeth, as they reached the central command room. The doors were sealed, but not for long. He gestured for Riva to hack the door's security system. Within moments, the door slid open, revealing the control room, a cold, metallic space with a large holographic display at the center. Standing before it was a figure, cloaked in shadows, radiating an aura of power that seemed to warp the very air around them. "You've come to stop me," the figure said, its voice low and menacing, but strangely calm. It stepped forward, and Cal could see the faint outline of its face, a face he had never seen before, but somehow it felt familiar. "We've come to end this," Cal said, his voice unwavering. "You've used the shadows, the fear to control countless civilizations, but we're not going to let you win. Not now, not ever." The figure tilted its head, a smile forming on its lips. "You think you've won, Deathworlder. This is just the beginning. The shadows were merely a taste of what's to come. You cannot stop the inevitable." Cal's grip on his weapon tightened. "We'll see about that." With a swift motion, the figure raised its hand, and the room was flooded with an eerie dark energy. The shadows materialized, swirling around the Deathworlders, trying to ensnare them. But Cal and his team were ready. They had faced the darkness before. "We end this now." Cale shouted. The battle that followed was unlike any Cale had ever fought. The figure was powerful, its shadowy powers almost overwhelming, but the Deathworlders were not so easily beaten. They pushed forward, cutting through the darkness with every strike, every move, every breath. The fight felt endless, but Cale knew they had to end it. With one final powerful strike, Cale lunged at the figure, his blade cutting through the shadow that enveloped it. The figure screamed, its form collapsing into nothingness as the dark energy dissipated around them. The room fell silent. The Deathworlders stood, panting and covered in the remnants of battle, their weapons still raised, waiting for any sign of a new threat. It was over. For now. Cale looked around at his team. They were battered, exhausted, but alive. They had done it. They had destroyed the heart of the enemy fleet, and the shadow that had haunted them for so long was gone. But Cale knew better than to think this was the end. The universe was vast, and there would always be new threats, new enemies, and new battles to fight. The shadows might be gone, but darkness would always return. "We won this fight," Cale said quietly, his voice steady. "But the war is far from over. We've shown them what we're made of, and they'll never forget it." The crew nodded in agreement. They had survived against all odds, and they would stand ready for whatever came next. As the Deathworlders made their way back to their ship, they knew one thing for sure. They would never stop fighting, because as long as the stars burned in the sky, they would always be ready to face the darkness.